welcome to this Anatomy in Yoga introduction. As we're beginning today, we're going to start with just a couple of basic awarenesses. We will be primarily studying from Anatomy of Movement from Blandine Calais-Germain, and as such she is our primary author. She's also written an Anatomy of Movement exercises book. And this, from time to time, is also a helpful adjunct. This isn't required reading, but if you find that it's helpful for you to break it down into tiny movements, this will be good for that. So I can't say enough good about the possibility of your studying being facilitated by coloring. And so if you are drawn to coloring books in any way, this is your big excuse to get an anatomy coloring book and allow yourself to go through one little part at a time and let yourself color in the parts that are making sense to you. It's a way to get you actively involved and engaged in the process of studying, and what we find is it makes it more interesting and also makes the information stick longer in your brain. So I'm hoping that that is helpful for you, and as such we are going to start with the three basic agreements that all anatomists have come to surrounding how we proceed. And as such, the agreements include that we want to be focusing on one joint at a time. As we think about the human body, we're aware that there are several different movements that can include more than one joint at a time. For instance, simply where I'm sitting to have my smoothie and to instruct, I've already moved just about everything to get me here, didn't I? So I have my hips are in a different position from the knees, different from where the ankles are, and then the arms are ongoingly gesturing. And so if I were to describe what I was doing in my body at any time, I could talk about everything all at once, and what that would do is confuse the issue. So anatomists, in their great wisdom, decided to break it down so we talk about just one joint at a time. And so I want to make sure that I get agreement from you about that, and that's okay with both of you. Really good. And so with that, that's our first of the three agreements, is we want to study one joint at a time. And so we're agreeing about that. So if you ask questions or you have issues and it's not pertaining to the joint that we're studying, we might back it down and break it up. So we talk about just one joint at a time. So that's our first agreement. Now we're going to come to the second agreement, which is that we want to work within, well, the earthly sphere, in which we've decided here that there are three planes of a way to describe anything, any kind of movement, any object existing within the three planes. And as such, we can think of it as if I were to describe an object like a chest of drawers, I'd want to say how tall is the chest of drawers, as well as how wide is the chest of drawers, as well as how deep is the chest of drawers. And then I'd know just how big that is, so I could maybe put it in my bedroom if I needed it. So in just that same way, when we're describing the physical body, we're operating within an awareness that there's a vertical plane as well as the horizontal plane. And there's, in addition, one other vertical plane in which we have a sense of the depth of the body. So in a general sense, we're working in a three-dimensional universe as 5 or 6 or 11-dimensional beings. But so for the purposes of understanding the three-dimensional world of the physical reality, we'll be talking about these three intersecting perpendicular planes. So in this way, I want you to have the awareness that these planes are intersecting one another at 90 degrees. So if I describe one vertical plane this way through the width of my body, we'd have one kind of description of what lies within and what movements occur within this plane. If I wanted to talk about instead another vertical plane that is perpendicular to it, I would show it this way. So this would give you a sense of, rather, I'll say, the height of my body. There's yet another 90-degree intersecting perpendicular plane, which is this way, which would be the horizontal plane. And so as we think of those three planes in our physical movement, we are then agreeing with the anatomists who say that, yes, we're going to describe body parts and movements within this third-dimensional reality of the physical existence. Okay? Now, the third agreement is that we have to start somewhere in the body, and anatomists who studied primarily dead bodies said that we should start with the way that we can dissect the body. So when we're lying on the ground and our hands are upward facing, as we do in yoga in the corpse posture of Shavasana, here we can come to know that that is called anatomical position, or anatomical neutrality. So in a standing position, we have an understanding that all we have to do to come into the standing position and find anatomical neutrality is from a standing neutral mountain posture, as in yoga, is simply to turn the hands open. In this position is like I'm a corpse posture on her feet, and as such, anatomists have decided that this is our base position from which all other movements are described, one joint at a time, and in 3 dimensions. And so these are now the agreements that I subject you to, both you who are present to this particular class that's offered, as well as those who are taking this class online. And as such, we'll be returning to these. This keeps us safe from getting too far afield in our brain that wants to know right now, what about this part in my back over here? Instead, we're going to take things one joint at a time, looking at the 3 dimensions as we move along, and starting from that anatomical neutrality. Now, when it comes to the 3 planes that we are focusing within, I want to start with what is the mid-sagittal plane. Any sagittal plane will divide the body right and left. So here's my description graphically of a sagittal plane straight up and down through the body. Up at the top it says mid-sagittal. Like I could have a sagittal plane over here on just slicing off one hunk of my thigh, or I could have a sagittal plane just here, just to the right of my crotch, or I could be just straight up through the center, which is what I'm after when it comes to the mid-sagittal plane. And that goes all the way through the center of the head as well. I could have a sagittal plane over here, to the left, or just taking off part of the thigh. But in general, what we were talking about initially is the one mid-sagittal plane that runs right through from the crown of the head, down through the center of the nose, through the center of the chest, through the navel, and then divides the legs, right and left. The sagittal plane will then allow for any movement within the sagittal plane, happens to divide the body into right and left halves. So the mid-sagittal plane, again right through the center of the face, if I were to move through the mid-sagittal plane, what I'm moving is into movements forward in space and backward in space. Movements forward and backward in space, moves along the same plane as this board is describing. And in doing so, we now can know that the names of the movements within the mid-sagittal plane are movements forward in the mid-sagittal plane are called flexion. So if I want to flex at my hips in the mid-sagittal plane, I fold forward and my body moves to the front of the space defined by the plane. If I'm working instead and moving backwards along in a sagittal plane, the movement's backwards towards the back of neutral. So starting from neutral as our baseline, any movement back of neutral is called extension. So we have flexion and extension. Here of the hip, here's hip flexion, here's hip extension. Here's trunk flexion and trunk extension. Here is shoulder flexion and shoulder extension. Hip flexion, hip extension. Then, unusual for the knee, this is knee flexion and this is knee extension. This is elbow flexion and elbow extension. This is wrist flexion, wrist extension. All of these movements are happening, we can say forward and backward in space. As such, we know that they're all happening within a sagittal plane. And in particular, the sagittal plane that we're after is the one sagittal plane right through the center of the body, the mid-sagittal plane. that starts to consider for us the sagittal plane. Now in a moment I'm going to have you at home and right here come up to standing and move in this way so it makes sense to you. So if you're able, you can put down your study materials and come on up into standing. And as you come to standing position, let yourself imagine that you had a board like this dividing you right through the body, front and back, which I can't quite do because I haven't gotten there yet. But it's a board that would divide you so that in right and left aspects are divided. Let yourself from here initially come into anatomical neutral with the arms out to the side, just like you're standing in a corpse position. And from here, allow the elbow simply to flex with the hand coming forward. Good. And then the elbow can extend back to neutral. Take that same arm and lift the whole arm forward. So this is shoulder flexion, and you can flex all the way up, just about. And then from there, as you're releasing back down, this is already called shoulder extension. And when you pass neutral and you keep going back, this is still called shoulder extension. From your deepest shoulder extension, you can flex just back to neutral or beyond neutral forward. In this way, now let's play with just the trunk movement. In the trunk, allow yourself to flex through the trunk, head will come forward. Oh, I don't usually ask you to do that, do I? Now instead, extend through the trunk just to neutral, and then from neutral, extend the trunk with the head coming back. Now flex the trunk just to get neutral, come back up. Now flex the trunk to move beyond neutral. Now extend through the trunk just to come back to neutral again. Really good. Now from here we start to get a sense of, oh, these are names that refer to movements, and that's the case. Flexion is a movement. Extension is a movement. Flexion does not describe a place in space. Okay? So these are terms of what is kinesiology. When we're studying kinesiology, we're studying into terms of movement. So now we are demarcating ourselves aside from the anatomists who are studying largely deceased bodies, right? And so instead, our living bodies are able to move in particular ways within these planes. And as such, we start to develop a movement awareness, a kinesthetic awareness of our bodies in space. And so we started with the mid-sagittal plane because that's the plane that breaks the body from right to left. Now instead, we're going to shift into the next of the three planes we'll describe. This is called the coronal plane. If you wish to sit back down and while we're hearing about it, you'd be welcome to. And with this a yellow color, you might want to zoom in on it a little bit so you can see the word coronal plane. This plane is also a vertical plane, but it divides the body front and back. In the body dividing front and back, if I stand here sideways, it's as if I could pass the board from my mid-thigh, mid-torso, mid-head, and then pass it all the way through me, which I can't, to the other side, okay? And so movements that occur within this plane are movements that, again, just are differentiating the front of the body from the back of the body. So movements that occur in this plane are movements that look like this, the trunk moving side to side. This is called ipsilateral flexion. Ipsit is one, lateral is to the side, and flexion is that specialized term of side bending. Okay? When it comes to the limbs, the movement away from the midline is called abduction, and the movement toward the midline is called adduction. Sometimes it's hard to hear the distinction, so in this little picture I wrote out abduction and adduction, and I underline the AB in abduction and the AD in adduction. That's so that as we abduct or abduct, we're moving away from the midline. And when we adduct or adduct, we're drawing back to the midline. Now I can abduct and adduct my leg as well. If I abduct at the level of the hip, the leg goes to the side. When I adduct, the leg comes back so I can stand back on it again. Obviously I can abduct and adduct my other leg, also my other arm when it's not holding a sign up, okay? And so as you, in just a moment, come back up to standing, I'm going to have you feel movements within the coronal plane. So as you're able, take a moment from your notes so you can come to standing And once you come to standing, envision that there's a line that's dividing your body, front and back, so that you can just move side to side in that one vertical plane that's called the coronal plane. In that way, with the side movements, feel that as side bending, and know that anatomists refer to that as ipsilateral flexion. Now from here, see if you can abduct a leg to the side. That's hip abduction and adduction. I ask you to stand on one leg to do so. That's why you're glad you practice yoga, right? And then abducting the leg to the other side, and then adducting it back to midline. Play it with one arm. Abducting an arm, and bringing it back down is adducting, and maybe with your other arm too. You can abduct the arm, and then adduct the arm. It starts off easy, doesn't it? Now from here, let's abduct through both of your arms. And then adduct both arms back down. Abducting both arms and adducting both. Now you can take that abduction all the way to shoulder height, but beyond. And back all the way down, adducting. Now you can adduct from here, but you could also come forward and cross midline. Abduction and adduction. Now this adduction asked us to flex just a little so we cleared the torso so we could cross. So sometimes we combine movements at any one joint. Check it out again. Here is abduction. Here is adduction. To come forward just a little is a tiny shoulder flexion. Then we can adduct even more. You can also abduct more. Okay. Now from here, play with it with your legs. You can abduct both legs apart. You can adduct both legs back together. If I did it really fast, it's like a jumping jack, right? So the abduction and adduction. So you can get the sense of this movement and this movement. These are all movements within the one coronal plane. Okay? You go. Now the next plane that we considered is called the transverse plane. Now the transverse plane gives us a sense of, in the name of it, that there will be movement sideways, transversing, crossing over. In the transverse plane, I'd want to hold this board up this way so that it's relatively a horizontal plane, and movements that would occur within the transverse plane would occur along a horizontal plane of awareness. So as you can see in my standing, the actions in the transverse plane look like this. And that could be here, that could be down here in the leg, it could be up here in the chest, it could be on my nose. All these motions that are occurring within the transverse plane are called rotation. Rotation is the name of the movement that occurs within the transverse plane. In this way, once you put your notes down and you're able to take a stand, I'll have you come on up and feel your way into the transverse plane. As you do so, just imagine for a moment that you have that flat board coming right off your belly like mine is, and see if you can try to start to move within that flat plane. That again, we're calling the transverse plane. Feel that in doing so, you're rotating to the right and then to the left. And feeling that rotation in the right and the left. You can know that when we're practicing yoga and you turn to the right, we call that a right rotation. Hey, that gets easy. When you rotate to the left, it's called a left rotation. That gets easy. Now you can bring this to stillness, and we can also rotate the limbs. Within the transverse plane, if you take your arm out and forward, and you rotate from the shoulder, your thumb will go out and in. This is rotation. I want you to feel it and know it. This is rotation inward and outward, we can say. And the rotation's coming from the shoulder. Now you could also just rotate the wrist. That's got specialized names, we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? But what I'm talking about primarily is that the action of the whole arm constant and the movement from the shoulder is called rotation. And we can also, well, let's try it on the left side, shall we? So rotate that left shoulder just a little bit. Now you can bring the shoulder quiet and let the rotation be of the wrist, but also in the shoulder joints. Can we do that in the hip joint? Oh, you bet. take most of your body weight onto one leg and rotating the foot open and then back in. Outward and inward, rotation coming from the hip. Now, it would be possible for me to keep the hip constant and just feel the rotation of the ankle. That's also similarly to what we described at the elbow. That's not what we're after right now because that has a specialized term of movement. We'll talk about that in a moment. Instead, feel that you've got the leg all as one unit, straight at the knee, and the foot is actually going along like the telltale sign of what's happening in the hip socket. You feel the hip is opening and that rotation outward, and then closing back down towards that rotation inward. Right on the other leg too, because you could do both. So the straight leg, shifting the body weight to the other hip, so you can operate in the hip, in the transverse plane in the hip, rotation opening and back in, lateral and medial rotation of the hip. So as I speak the little image down that gives us a couple of clues about it, we can take the lateral rotation of all four limbs at once, and then the medial rotation of all four limbs at once, lateral and medial. In this way, we have a sense of, in a general sense, our effort in yoga is not towards medial rotation, which tends to close the joints of the shoulders and the hips. And you can see it in my body, that if I said to you, just like this, you want to come practice yoga with me? You'd probably say, no. Could you fix your posture a little bit? Maybe then. So I'm going to come back up to neutral, anatomical neutral here. And then from neutral, I'm just going to open the feet a little bit. And maybe less than that, not quite a first position turnout. And as such, we can feel a little greater openness in the front of the hips. And this is where it is that we ask our yoga practitioners and yoga teachers to continue to access their awareness of hip movement. So subtle lateral rotation, that's in the transverse plane. As such, come on back down into your seated position. And just feel as you come into the seated posture, well, you had to flex the hips, so that was movement within the sagittal plane. And then you had to abduct those knees apart, that was movement within a coronal plane. And then both hips laterally rotated, and so that was movement within the transverse plane. All three actions happen just at the level of your hip. That's just to sit down on your butt, okay? And that means that in anything that you're doing, it's likely that you're having combined actions in any given joint at any given time. And as such, that's why we like to break it down now when things can be simple, so you get a sense of just one movement at one time, at one joint, so that we can start to know in our minds that these are whole collections of categories of muscles. For instance, we will find, as I back up to the mid-sagittal plane that we started with, that awareness of the dividing line from right and left in the body. We've decided that movements within those planes from kinesiology are called flexion and extension. But what you can know is that there's going to be a whole category you want to open up in your mind, like a file that you don't have filled in with documents yet, that's going to be called flexors of particular joints. So we're going to find, as we study along, that there's a whole category of shoulder flexors. There's a category of elbow flexors. There are hip flexors. There are knee flexors, etc. And similarly, of course, there are extenders. There are shoulder extenders, spinal extenders, hip extenders, knee extenders. So you'll start to put in your brain a certain awareness that we have these particular agreements, these terms that describe movements within the three planes, and then with that, as we study one joint at a time, as is our convention, from the anatomically neutral position, we'll come to know the muscles that flex that joint and that extend that joint, as well as when it comes to the coronal plane, we'll come to understand that there are muscles that are shoulder abductors, shoulder adductors. We'll find that there are hip abductors and hip adductors. So this is now a category of muscle groups. We'll find that there are, within the coronal plane, in addition, we've decided that this movement, side to side, ipsilateral flexors, we'll find that there's a category of muscles that are called ipsilateral flexors of the trunk. So my hope is that over time, studying a little bit of kinesiology will help your further study of anatomy. The third joint, just to have the third plane in which we're studying movements through the transverse plane, knowing that movements within the transverse plane are called rotation, through the shoulder, through the leg, as we played when we were standing. Now we can know that there will be categories of muscles that are called rotators. Well, what are the lateral rotators of the shoulder? What's the group of medial rotators of the shoulder? There's a group of lateral hip rotators, medial hip rotators. Rotators of the neck, to the right and to the left. Rotators of the trunk. So we'll start to have a category of movement, and you'll start to see their name in the name of the muscle. For instance, just to make it easy, when we study the spine, and we look at the muscles, the tiny muscles that surround the spine that are so important, there will be one collection of muscles around the spine that are going to be called rotatores. And what that is going to let us know already is, are they going to help us rotate or what? Like the name tells you what they're for. And so that's why we want to break down the awareness of kinesiology, in that the terms that underpin kinesiology create the categories of muscles that we can then more readily understand in anatomy. And so these are just the beginning concepts that you want to be able to study in anatomy, so that we can build upon this as we do move along, and certainly we are. Now we have a group of paired terms that will further inform all the rest of what we've been describing so far. And let me start with one I've already been using. Paired terms, these are terms of reference. So these are terms that are going to be referring to one another. Sorry for the bad sound. So I'm going to sit up there, and I think we might be able to get a little look. So here we have lateral and medial. These terms I'm trying to use as a graphic, so you can see the middle word is medial. That means toward the center of the body. Okay? Lateral, I've written on either side and thrown on the floor, and that's so that you can know that lateral is going to be towards either side, right or left. Okay? In this concept of lateral and medial, we have a sense that in the body there are going to be muscles that reside lateral to others and medial to others. So we have a way to describe things within the body relative to itself. So wherever you can see that, that's Shauna, that's it. So we already used those terms in the body when it came to lateral and medial rotation of a hip, when I was talking about our own particular preference for lateral rotation in the hips when we're standing in mountain. So I want you to just take out a leg, either one will do. I do not always use the same one, by the way. And as we do, first take a medial rotation. Now, not the foot in, but the whole hip turns in. You can tell that because the knee turns in. This is a medial rotation, an internal or medial toward the midline rotation. And from there, take a lateral rotation just to neutral, and then from there, rotate even beyond to more lateral, so to the outside instead for Matthew. That's lateral rotation, that's to the outside. Now take that back to neutral, and then beyond neutral to the inside, that's medial rotation. So medial and lateral rotation of the hips up. Making sense? Lateral and medial. Rotation of the hips up. If you want it, then you can have it. Another set of paired terms. This is anterior, as in towards the front of the body. And if you think the other one's going to be posterior, you're right, and that beyond that towards the back of the body. So relative to one another, we have muscles that are more anterior to others that may be more posterior, which is to say we don't just have one central inside tube of us. We have layers, and some of the layers are more forward in the body to others that are more backward in the body. As such, some are described by forward and backward becomes hard to describe when you're on the inside. So we say more anterior or posterior. To the front and the back. Making sense. A little bit easier. Easier term there. Next set of terms of reference is deep. And then superficial, which I have surrounding this depth in the graphic. So there are some structures in the body that are deep to other structures in the body that are more superficial. Which is to say that on the outside of the body, as I'm grabbing a hold, I've got a hold of some skin here, and some of the stuff underneath the skin, that's called some nice adipose tissue, just the right amount to keep me a little bit soft around those otherwise cut muscles. So we can say that this stuff, superficial, compared to what's underneath it, the musculature itself is deeper than the soft stuff on top. Again, the fat and the skin. But the muscle itself, and I'm grabbing onto it, a nice friendly deltoid here, I can say this is still superficial as compared to what's underneath it more, which is the bone of the shoulder itself. And in this way, what I'm going for in terms of shoulder joint made of 3 bones is I'm grabbing a hold of my upper arm bone, which is called the humerus. So the bone, humerus, is deep to the musculature, deltoid, which is more superficial. But it's not nearly as superficial as is the skin. So this starts to give us a sense, again, that there are layers to what we're describing. And so it helps us to have a sense of, oh, is that deepest level in this body part we're talking about? Or not? Oh, no, that's more superficial. Okay, now we have an understanding. Superficial and deep. Next set of paired terms is superior and inferior. So superior is towards the head, towards the top of the body if I'm in this relationship to gravity. And inferior. Inferior doesn't mean it's not as good as. It's not, my toes are not as, they're not quite as good as the head. No, they're just down there. So that which is down there is inferior to that which is up here, which is superior. This is especially helpful for yoga in terms of yoga instructors and yoga practitioners, of course, who like to practice spending time inverted, which is a yoga term for spending time upside down, meaning with your head below the heart. Right? So if I did a handstand with my piece of paper here, or a headstand, or maybe a forearm stand if you prefer, or a shoulder stand, my head would be down here, and my feet would be up here. This is still superior. The head is still superior to the feet, which are still inferior. So if a person's upside down, you could still have a sense of, oh, they need to be moving superiorly or inferiorly. You'd still have a sense of toward the head or toward the feet, and not get lost about the word up and down, which generally could mean, up with respect to gravity, against gravity. Okay, making sense? So in these ways, we have these terms that are terms of reference. We use these terms to further influence and affect what we're describing otherwise, and they're always related to another word. Deep is only relative to superficial. Superior is only relative to inferior. Anterior is just relative to posterior, understood, and lateral is just referral to that word, which is lateral and medial. The last set of paired terms of reference are proximal and distal. I don't know if you're getting all these, but if you see in the graphic, in proximal, I used a big X to mark the spot. So proximal is something about close to the spot. X is marking the spot. Let's have separately from that a little dot over here. Like here's a dot. What's close to it? Well, the circle I put around it's pretty close to it. That's proximal. That would be as compared to another point. If I put another point way down here on the piece of paper, this point would be distal with respect to this circle that's surrounding the proximal point. Meaning distal means farther away. Farther away from what? Generally farther away from the center of the body, or farther away from the center of the limb that we're talking about. So sometimes it's right where the limb joins the trunk. Generally it's towards the midline of the body. Distal and proximal. What's closer to the center, what's farther away. So these are ways to get us to think inside the body. And so far, most often in the world, we think about what's on the outside of the body. We think about what's the cute outfit we put on, and do we have our lipstick on? No, I don't. Here I am, as I am. That's that's the outside of the body, and anatomy is really not about the outside of the body, but really much more about what is on the inside of the body. What's happening in there? What can it move? So in these ways we start to understand, well, the body can move, and the movements of the body start to speak volumes of what the underlying structures are. And this will over time help us have a better awareness of what we have on the inside of the body without having to wait until we're dead to find out. Now, in addition to these particular movements within the planes that were described before, so again, we're thinking about kinesiology, and we're working with these three planes: the transverse plane, the coronal plane, and the sagittal plane. And we have that within the sagittal plane, movements are called flexion and extension. Within the coronal plane, movements are called abduction and adduction. And then movements within the transverse plane are called rotation. If I said right and left rotation, you'd say, yes, so what? Okay. Could be lateral and medial rotation, that works too. In addition to those general broad categories of movements within the joints, we also have specialized terms of movements within joints that are specialized and unique to the particular joint. I want to start with something easy, and sometimes easy is the hardest thing to do. We come to what we practiced a little bit earlier on in our regular class, which is we worked with a specialized hip movement in which we were circumducting the hip. We were lying on our back, and we started to circle the hip, and we did it with the knee bent. We also straightened through the knee. We also did, we're lying down, we lengthened out the other leg. All of that was to circumduct the hip. That means I was moving through, well, a flexed position, then I abducted it, then I extended it with a lateral rotation, then I drew it back in, that's adduction, medial rotation, and then brought it right through. Circumduction. So the hip can circumduct. It means it can do this, it can do that, it can do that, but can it also do everything? Sometimes. Circumduction. I have a fun body. It's done really well for me all these years. It's just amazing. And boy, we've been through everything together. It's a yoga joke. So what I'm going to do for you is just give you an example, an illustration of circumduction in my 53-year-old body that tends to speak volumes of it. So what I want to do is to give you a sense of, here I am seated with my hips flexed. From this flexed position, I'm going to abduct my legs to the side. That's abduction. As I come up and over, this is lateral rotation through both hips. And then if I keep coming forward, I adduct the legs back together, there's medial rotation and extension. Thanks for moving so I can get in there. So you can see in the demonstration that the legs go, meaning the hips go, that's called circumduction, circling around the hips, the hip socket. We don't all have 360 degrees of potential within the hips. Depending on how we're put together, you might never get to anything close to 360 degrees. That's not the goal of our mission. It's demonstration for you of what the word circumduction means, so that you have a sense of, oh, 360 degrees, you're still circumducting your hips as well. And so now you have a sense that the hips have a specialized term of movement because of the way they're put together anatomically. It's a ball and socket joint. The ball circumducts within the socket, and that'll become clearer as we move along. Circumduction. Now as it applies to the shoulder joints, we have several different specialized terms of movement at the shoulder. So I'll wait for a moment and come to the shoulder by itself. Trying to find something easy sometimes is a little bit of a challenge, but let's come into the wrist action. Specialized term of movement of the wrist. Two specialized terms here. Supination and pronation. Supination, with the palm open, the elbow is flexed, and the thumb is outward. In this way, I could, as you might be able to see in the close-up on the drawing, I have two little soup bowls here, right on the S and on the U. In supinated position, I could give you a bowl of soup, and you could eat it, right? The thumbs would be out, the palms are upward. This is supinated in the palm. I could give you a bowl of soup. You could hold it in your hands. Does that make sense to you? Supinate. You can have the soup bowl, you can eat it too. Supinate. If you don't like the soup, throw it on the floor. Now you can pronate. This is called pronation, thumbs towards the center. We generally stand in a pronated position. We generally stand with our thumbs inward. Where we like to hang out, unless we're dead, is with our thumbs inward, with the wrist generally pronated. When we stood up and we stood to shift to anatomical neutral, we supinated the palms, didn't we? We stood up and we opened the thumbs outward. We didn't generally do it from the shoulder, which is a lateral rotation from the shoulder joint. We could have done it from there, but we generally just flip out, open those thumbs, and that's called supination. So if I were to ask you, what's the difference between standing mountain and the anatomical neutral position, you could say, well, the wrist is supinated in the anatomical neutral position, and you'd be absolutely correct. Does this make sense? I'm hoping so. And it looks like it is. Supination and pronation. Now I want to just clarify that this is sometimes confused with when you want to buy some new fancy running shoes, and you go to the shoe store, and there's a nice guy who wants to sell you some really fancy shoes there, and he says he wants to watch your gait, I mean watch how you walk, and then he'll say, oh, you seem to be a pronator, so you need to buy this particular supination insert in your shoe. Are you familiar with these terms? Yeah. A little bit, thank you. Yeah, right? And so, so shoe sales people will say that this and this in the ankle is the same as the hand. That's great. Buy your shoes, or don't, whatever it is, that's fine. But in terms of anatomy, this is not called supination in the foot. It is called it in the hand, meaning the wrist supinates, but the ankle does not. Okay? The wrist pronates, the foot does not, to anatomists. Don't try to tell your shoe salesperson that. He's not interested in anatomy. He's interested in selling you shoes. Okay? So he wants to sell you shoes, fine, buy them or don't. When it comes to your awareness of the ankle movement, though, get a sense that supination and pronation refer to the wrist movement and not the ankle movement. Ankle movement, instead, is happening in a different plane, and as such, this action, which I most often have done when I've sprained my ankle, which maybe you can relate to, is this action of rolling out on the foot is called eversion. This is an everted ankle, an eversion injury. Here's inversion, like pronation, which looks like when a person has a flat foot, there's no arch in the foot. Inversion, it looks like what would be called pronation in the hand. Inversion and eversion. Inversion and eversion. In the wrist is pronation and supination. Here's supination and pronation, right here. Supination, soup and eat it, pronation. action here, instead eversion, away from the midline, the big E. That's the prefix, right? That's the prefix of our, the new millennium, right? Everything's email, electric, everything's about E and then sending it off. eBay, E, away, away. So you're away from midline and eversion. And when the foot instead dumps the arch, immediately, inversion. Now get this, when we teach yoga, we teach inversion. We're not teaching that as a part of the body movement and collapsing in, no. So when you're teaching yoga and you're teaching inversions, we're talking about inverting in space with the head below the heart. We're not talking about what anatomists refer to as inversion. Anatomists use the term of this movement of the ankle inward as inversion. That's the only use of the word inversion. A physiological term for this movement at the level of the ankle. Now the ankle does some other fun stuff too, doesn't it? The ankle also, this is within the sagittal plane, in other words, within the coronal plane as well as in the transverse plane. But in the mid-sagittal plane, or in the sagittal plane through either foot, we have the terms of dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Plantar flexion we think of in the dance realm as pointing your toe. Plantar flexion is we plant the foot onto the earth and we lift up the heel. Plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion, the top of the foot, the anterior surface of the foot, is considered the dorsal surface of the foot. This would be dorsal, this would be ventral, right? Here's the dorsal surface, like the back surface. If I had a dorsal fin out my shark back, it'd be back here. This would be the back of the foot, right? Here's the ventral surface, dorsal, ventral. That's what we use when we're talking about things that swim, but when we're talking about bodies that are walking around on their hind legs, hopefully, what we're after is instead dorsal and plantar. So dorsiflexion is what I like to call a heel dig. Heel digging, deepening the angle in the opening of the heel, and doing so, this action of dorsiflexing and plantar flexing is specialized. We don't call it that in the wrist. I can't dorsiflex my wrist, but I can my ankle. Heel dig. Plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion. Specialized kinesiological term for very specialized joint in the body. Specialized movements within the ankle. So here we had ankle showing up in two places with inversion, eversion, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. And as such, when we study the foot, and if you're interested in studying the ankle, and if, like me, you've had repeated ankle injuries, you might get very particularly interested in actions of the toes, actions of the foot, midfoot, and the ankle as it pertains to the knee. All of this you might find it's helpful for you to have broken down categories of terms of movements of the foot, because there are going to be movements of the foot, muscles that have groupings that go into those particular categories that now you have opened in your mind, little files of possible understanding in your mind. So really good work. So these are the specialized terms of movements as they apply to the ankle. We also have specialized terms of movement as it refers to the sacroiliac joint. The sacroiliac joint, sometimes written as the sacroiliac joint. Here I have it with a S-A-C-R-A-L-I-L-L-I-A-C. And others will take the A-L and turn it into an O, depending on if your anatomist is British, or English, or French, or etc. Sometimes it's written as sacroiliac, and other times sacroiliac. The abbreviation in either way is the SI joint. S for sacral, I for iliac. There are movements that occur at the specialized joint that are called nutation and counter-nutation. Often when a woman is going through her own reproductive cycle, she can at times have pain in one or the other sacroiliac joint that can come from getting stuck in the movement of nutation or counter-nutation on one side or the other of the pelvis. I say it to you that way so you start to have an awareness in your mind about pain back here is sometimes pain in a joint, and sometimes it's pain in the particular joint of the sacroiliac area. Sacroiliac joints are to move subtly throughout each monthly cycle for a woman. And I'm going to say the men also have their own monthly cycles, and so you guys have a little bit of movement too within the joint, there's no doubt about it. But the time when we can experience and know the movements of the sacroiliac joint most clearly has to do with childbirth. When the baby is growing in mama's belly and getting ready, okay, that was anatomically incorrect within the mama's womb, but you get the idea. The baby's getting bigger and bigger, and it's getting ready, time to come on out, and the first thing that happens is the top of the pelvis opens more, and the bottom of the pelvis closes more, and that allows the baby's head to drop. Maybe you're aware of that experience or of that expression, that the baby's head dropped. Maybe when your niece or nephew was born, you heard, oh, the baby's coming, the head dropped. That means that the first stage in the pelvic shift has occurred so that the baby can come on out. That first shift of the top of the pelvis opening with respect to the bottom of the pelvis closing a little bit is the movement that's called counter, it's called, the first stage is abduction of the top of the pelvis. It's called counter-nutation. Top opens, bottom closes. So the baby's head can come down closer to coming out. Then the next biochemical message that comes really, really soon is the one that allows then the reverse to happen. So that the head's all in the cavity, ready to come out. Now we want to get that head out. And that means that we go from the counter-nutation position, with the top of the pelvis wider apart than the bottom of the pelvis, upper sacroiliac joint wider apart than the bottom of the sacroiliac joint, to now, instead, bottom of the SI joint opens more, top of the SI joint closes. That's called nutation, and that allows the sit bones to widen apart and the baby to come out. Now we can think of it about giving birth, but having never done it myself, I'm here to tell you, my body also nutates and counter-nutates, but in a much lesser amount. So we can also feel the experience of the widening of the sit bones apart as we nutate, and also we can feel the shifting of the top of the pelvis in the other direction as we counter-nutate. And the way that we do that best is in a very basic position that we do in yoga, well, daily, where I come from. And so I'm going to have you come on up and give a try to move into what is the widespread forward bend. Now, I think you probably won't pick it up too much on the camera, but as I take my legs wide and spread across my little happy anatomy pile, I'm keeping my spine nice and neutral and the hands come along the legs, and this action already widens the bottom of the sit bones apart and takes the top of the sacroiliac area closer together. This facilitates nutation. Try it. Spread out your mat, or stand on this mat, and that's good, or stand on that mat over there if you want to, if it's easier. Be safe with yourself as you're working. That's the way. And then with the legs wide spread apart, hinge at the hips, you might even take your hands onto your sit bones, and you can feel the sit bones widen apart as you fold forward. And then when you come back up, those same two sit bones will come closer to one another. And you might not feel a thing, so I'm going to give it to you this way, and I bet you can see it from there. I'm going to turn around backwards. I'm going to put my fingers right on my sit bones, which are like the telltale signs of what's happening in the sacroiliac joint, just like the foot was the telltale of the hip. I'm going to give it to you this way. When I start off, here's my fingers touching my sit bones this far apart. As I bend forward and I start to nutate, my fingers get wider apart as the sit bones get wider apart. When I go from here back up, watch how my fingers will start to come closer towards one another. The widening apart is what's occurring at nutationing of the sit bones. The narrowing together is the counter-nutation of the sit bones. As I come on back. Helpful for you to move in the body to feel these terms of movement specifically in the body yourself, so you can start to get a sense of it.
You can make my cord is narrowing.
when you first go in forward and the legs are wide and spread, the action initially is called nutation. The narrowing is at the upper or superior aspect of the sacroiliac joint. But the sit bones themselves widen apart. So again, getting the relative to one another. So when you bent forward, the bottom widened apart, but the top got closer together. That was nutation. When we counter-nutate, we come back to neutral. The top widens a little bit, and the bottom comes closer together. It's a complicated idea, so I appreciate taking the time for the questions. I'm sure you, also watching the video in your own space, have those questions too, so I appreciate the particulars. Mutation and counter-nutation. Really good. Now here, next set of particular kinesiological terms are from the standpoint of the shoulders. Now, what I'd like us to do for this is to come into, I'm going to have Matthew maybe come here and sit here in front of me. Yeah, and you can turn around and you can face the camera. I'm going to sit right in front of me. These are all movements for the shoulder joint. Okay? First of all, the shoulder can move this way into elevation and depression. You see the arrow points up and down at the level of the shoulders. Now I want for Matthew to just lift the shoulders up by your ears. Just the shoulders. Good. This is elevation. And then this is depression. Yeah, try it again. Elevation and then depression. Good. One more time. Elevation. Good. And depression. Excellent. You're a professional now. It's good. Now give yourself a hug. Yes. And then release it. Do it again. There's the hug, and then release it. And one more time, give a nice big hug all the way. When you're hugging your shoulders, this is the action of protracting the scapula. The shoulders are widening apart in the back. And then instead, when he releases the shoulders from the hug, let go of the hands. Then we're retracting the scapula back. And Matthew's going to retract even further. Bring your shoulders back. Yes, and then that makes him sit up even taller. Now go back again to the hugging. And this is protraction. And then release and then retract. So let go and retract all the way back. Good. And again, protract and then retract. Really good. Now from these, I'm going to bring you to a holding position. I'm holding on to Matthew's scapula. I'm going to have you take your arms to the sides of the shoulders. You're going to take a really slow jumping jack. You're going to go all the way up and then all the way back down. And you're going to do that while my hands are here. And the arms go up. This is called upward rotation of the scapula. And then back down. That's downward rotation. Feel the movement underneath my fingers. Reach the arms up. And feel this part widens apart at the bottom and narrows in at the top. And then bring the arms back down. And then the reverse happens. Underneath, the two inferior angles of the scapula come closer together and the top part widens apart. That's upward and downward rotation. Really nice. Now, Matthew, I'm going to have you come. He was really good. Yay. All right. I'm going to have you go on back over to your seat. And as you play with that, I'm going to have Shauna come up, and we're going to do that again. Now, Shauna, we're going to try that same work, but from the back. So I'm going to have you turn and face me. All the way here. And I'm going to have you now see if we can feel these. You were already playing with them and studying them, and I'm just going to let them see your pretty back, just like you are, just in your nice t-shirt. Okay? We'll start with the easy one, which is the shoulder elevation and depression. So from here, I'll have Shauna just lift up her shoulders towards her ears. There's this elevation, very clear demonstration. Arrows going upward, elevation, and then scapular depression. So down with the shoulders all the way down. And just take them back up and down a couple of times. Elevation and then depression. And again, elevate and depress. Now you could probably do one at a time. Can you elevate just one? Ooh, and then depress that one. Ooh, and then the other one. Ooh, and then back down. Ooh, and then both of them. Yeah. See all that? You can do all that too. So that's all good stuff. Elevation and depression within the sagittal plane. Now this is what the hugging looks like on the backside. Now you did great, Matthew. I appreciated it completely. Watch as Shauna gives herself a hug. You see the upper back starts to open. Now do it like you really like yourself. Yes. And the upper back just open more. That's protraction. Now watch, I'm taking my fingers towards the scapula. Watch instead as you release the arms. And protract again, like you're giving yourself the hug. Ooh, wider apart for me to hug. That's it. Protraction. And then releasing and bringing it back down and into retraction. This is retracting the scapula. The re gives us the clue. We're returning to our starting position. And one more time, baby girl. Protracting, giving yourself that hug, opening the upper back, and then retracting back to neutral. Okay? So then that makes sense as you see it again and again. Now when we combine both, and the way I did this with Matthew, and you saw me do it, is just to take the really slow jumping jack. But as I get in position, I want to stay out of the camera angle, but I want you to be able to see on the scapula the action. Take your arms to the sides of the shoulders, and then all the way out to the side, like a slow jumping jack, up and overhead. Oh wow! Upward rotation, and then back down. Downward rotation. Excellent. You're going to do that a few more times, nice and slowly. Upward rotation, the bottom of the scapula, wings wider apart, and the top gets closer together. And then reverse. As we downwardly rotate, the lower inferior angle of the scapula gets closer together, and the top widens. And one more time. Slow jumping jack, open. Top gets closer, bottom gets wider, and then in the reverse. Yeah, really nice. And that's the way. You did super good. Now your back is pretty, but give me your smiley face for just a second. There she is, looking good. Upward and downward rotation. Good. Now I try to bring through the graphics in a way that makes sense, but just in case anything's escaped your understanding, let me just give it to you this way. Because I think it's all pretty much right there. Elevation, depression, one side or the other. Protraction, this is the widening of the scapula part. I wouldn't have to hug myself, it's just a way that most of us can get into the felt sense without the hugging. Here's back to neutral, but here's the retraction even closer together. So here's protraction, and here's the retraction. Upward rotation, I think you can even see without the fingers, if you look just at the scapula. In the upward rotation, we're combining the two of elevation and protraction. And when we return back to neutral, we're depressing the scapula as well as retraction. So upward rotation is that combination of elevation and protraction, and depression of the scapula combined with retraction is called downward rotation. I'm thinking that was all pretty clear in a few different ways, yeah? It's good. Now, we also have the shoulder movement. One more specialized term, shoulders are very special. Of what's called, don't know if you can get this one very clearly, but you've done really well so far. It's called horizontal flexion. Horizontal flexion. I'm thinking this is because they used up every other word they could come up with, but I'm just going for it this way. Horizontal flexion combines flexion, as in shoulder flexion, movement towards the front of the body, flexion. It combines flexion with abduction. In dance, we think of this as presentation. So as we come onto the stage and we want to open and present, we take the arms up and then we open it apart. Anatomists call it horizontal flexion. We can horizontally flex in an abducted position as well as in an adducted position. But that gives us a sense of, well, what do you call it when you want to, give somebody the old backhand, right? Well, that's what we call it, horizontal flexion. So now you have a sense that we can move in all these ways with terms that help to define what the movement actually is, and get that these are all movements that are occurring from and about a particular joint. So what I want to do is start to introduce you to my skeletal friend, who we colloquially refer to as Lucy, and so that you can start to have a sense of the skeleton as a way to come to understand the body. Now, we're going to back up into skeletal awareness tomorrow, in which we'll describe the anatomy of any given bone in general, as well as the names of all of the bones and where they reside in space. But for just right now, what I want you to do is you're taking a look at Lucy, is get a sense that Lucy starts to bring through where in particular the bones are starting and stopping. The general shape of the bones and the general location. Like for instance, I take Lucy off his stand so that we can start to see that the spine and the pelvis moving as one unit just about would require what Lucy has, which is a bar up the back, just to keep the spine continuous with the pelvis. And then we have the legs freely hanging. So this is a pretty clear example of hip flexion. Hip, not a general place where we put the belt on top of the jeans. No, that's not a hip. We tend to think that this is a hip, whereas the hip is here, the hip socket is here. So anatomists are very clear that we're not talking about hip, stick it, hugged, and the hip hugger genos. We're talking about hips as in the place where the femur joins the pelvis. So that if we have muscles that are hip flexors, they're going to be operating just right here in this way. And muscles that are hip extenders would bring us back up to neutral like this. Similarly, in the shoulders, as Lucy's just hanging out, we have here the arms are just hanging freely downward in an action that's partially flexed at the shoulder. And that helps to differentiate between shoulder action and the rest of the trunk action. So here's the deeper flexion of the shoulder without the spine, without the trunk having to move. Often when beginning students start to move in yoga, they don't have a sense of any of this. Not a real clear sense of where is movement supposed to be occurring from. Okay? We tend especially to get confused when it comes to the hips. We tend to think that, and what Lucy can't do is bend through the spine because the rod is in the back. You might even have some students that way. That, in the old version of how you deal with scoliosis, would be to put a rod up the spine. And that is what Lucy has, is that rod right up the back. Imagine for a moment that you had a rod up your back. Let me see what it would be like. Sit on up. Oh, there's a rod up my back now, so I think I'll remember what that's like, right? Now from there, try to hinge at the hips and fold forward, but keep the rod in your back. So from a neutral standing position, just folding forward, flexing at the hips. Keep the spine neutral, like that, right? Really good. Now come on back up. Now I'm going to have you do the don't. It's just, yes, Lucy and I can't, but you can. And feel how that's totally different. That's a movement in the trunk to flex the trunk. Totally valuable thing to do, but generally what we're after is trying to protect the back in ways that will become very clear to you later on. So just like that, really nice. Good. And you want to try this stuff at home too. So when you're watching, you can always pause and give a little moment and then see how it is. See if this is making sense to you. Because if it's not, I want you to be back in touch with me so that we can help to clean up whatever is not good. And then we'll see if I can get Lucy back on the stand here.
So in a way, it could be helpful to have a rod up your back.
Well, I'll tell you when it used to be helpful, is before we knew how to help scoliosis any better. And it used to be really helpful to have a rod up your back if you were getting so scoliotically distorted that the pain was excruciating and it was starting to affect your other systems. Over time, we found there are lots of other ways that physiotherapists can help people with scoliosis without having to require surgery. And depending on how early the onset was of the particular disorder and how it got to be there. Some people are born with scoliosis and need to have even, I've had friends who had to have their whole body put in a cast for a lengthy period of a year in order to straighten out that spine. So now I bring it forward to you these ways because, gee, which would you prefer? A spine up your back or to be in a cast for a year? Or wouldn't you just instead prefer to engage your muscles? So yeah, see, this is what I'd rather. Because when I heard what it was like to be encased in a cast for, you know, I think it was 15 months, that didn't sound like much fun to me. I don't know about you. I like to move more than that. And even the students I've had that have had the bar surgically implanted in their back to help with the scoliosis have been benefited, there's no doubt, from what otherwise the scoliosis was going to do to them. But the pain above where the bar stops and where it ends can still be excruciating. And then there's this whole issue that then there's just the regular movements that we'd like to do in the body can't occur. So I like the idea that it could be helpful, but instead I'd rather have you sit up against the post from time to time until your own core is strong enough to keep you upright. Because I know Matthew and I like the idea that we can work our muscles and get strong enough in the body to keep our own selves erect. And you're doing a good job of it. It's really good. And from here, as we are going to start to bring this to a conclusion in a way that will not be so interesting for you out in viewing land. As we do, I'm going to just start to distribute materials, and for those of you who are considering such, we have quite the large handout of particulars on the skeletal system as well as the muscular system, and so that's what we're going to come into next. So you can go ahead and close this presentation.